This is a presentation that the Detroit LERA chapter does to keep informing our LERA members and those people involved in human resources and labor relations on the cutting edge of what we do in our business. Whether you're a labor organization or an employer or public or private sector, neutral, all of these things are the kinds of skills that can help build your practice and your ability to do your job better. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Smith now, the Executive Director of our National LERA, and let her go ahead and make whatever announcement she thinks would be appropriate for us to hear.
Thank you so much, Bob. Welcome. Thank you for coming, everyone. There are just a few things I'd like to share with you. We were supposed to be meeting in Detroit this June, which we were very excited to do. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we will be meeting virtually on June 5th through 8th, 2021. So you can all still attend, and you're welcome to register for that event. It's a 4-day event. It has over 90 sessions happening. Half of them are specifically for practitioner information, and the other half are usually papers. But half of that content will be really relevant to a lot of people on this call. So I encourage you all to register for that. We will return to Detroit in 2022 in person, hopefully. So we already have contracts in place, and we are committed to coming to Detroit and very excited to do that. And that will be in the first week of June in 2022. In the meantime, leading up to the meeting in June, we also have a series of webinars coming up that are free for anyone who would like to attend. We've already completed 1 day of the series, and we have 2 remaining. One is on March 18th, which is next week, and one is on April 15th. And next week is going to be focusing on all about the future of employment arbitration and the future of labor arbitration, what that's going to look like down the line. So I encourage you all to attend that. Again, that is practitioner-oriented content. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. So before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you what's coming up between now and the end of our program year. In April 8th, we'll have Professor Clint Longenecker from the University of Toledo presenting to us. Clint is a vivacious, exciting speaker and scholar, and he's going to be talking about why HR leaders get fired and what they can learn and explore before that happens. He recently completed a study on that. I've read the paper. It's excellent. And for those of you that are in leadership positions and you don't want to get fired, you might want to see that one. And then on May 13th, we'll be having Gina Weatherup. She's with Chantilly Mediation and Facilitation. She takes a different sort of unique approach on mediation. And for those of you that are involved in ADR and mediations and arbitrations, or you might want to learn something about it, we hope you'll attend that. And then we'll be ending on June 10th with Adam Foreman. He's an attorney from Epstein Becker. And on an annual basis, he does a presentation to our LERA chapter here on the law and social media. And he has a large paper that he makes available to any of the people that attend. But if you want to understand what in the area of labor and employment law we need to know as it relates to social media, Facebook, any of the electronic types of communication, I can assure you that you will learn a lot from Adam on that. And then we'll go into a break for the summer, and we'll start up again after that in September. Now to our speaker for today, Barbara Bolt. She is a communication specialist. I would consider her a strategic communication specialist, but she has a very unique background. She's multilingual. She's lived in Europe for 20 years. She, in particular, helps those people that may not be native speakers. But even aside from that, what a strategic communication specialist does is helps you craft a message. What we say and what we do, how we say it and how we do it, are very, very important. And for those of us in the HR area, we know that all too much. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to have been invited. Thank you for having me. And I've got a couple of friends out in the audience, so I'm excited about that as well. I've been involved with the HR community here in Michigan pretty much ever since I moved back to the US. And I moved back in end of 2012. I got involved with SHRM in 2014, and that's how I met a lot of people in the HR community. But I hadn't actually known much about LERA. So this has been a really great thing to learn about this particular organization, and it's the specialized area in which you all work. I did teach international negotiation for 12 years at a Swiss university in a master's program. So I do know a lot about, well, something about negotiation. I'm not focusing the presentation on that today particularly, but we're going to mention it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, everybody can see that. I'll put it up full screen. There we go. The topic that when Bob put it out to me to actually present for you today, I was sort of like, oh my gosh, what could I talk about? I did a little bit of poking around out on the net as we do, and I came across a very interesting article about communication in labor relations. It actually was framed, it's a South African paper, actually. I used it as the basis for this presentation, but it's not only, I didn't only use that particular resource. But in reading that particular paper, I thought what would be useful to talk about from a communication standpoint would be this idea of communicating with intent. It's a very interesting area to me. As Bob mentioned, he likes to refer to me as a strategic communications specialist. I don't know that that's particularly true, but what I'm very, very interested in is clarity. How do we get clarity in our communication? I'll often talk about that, particularly in the context of presenting information. But if you think about it, clear communication is important in pretty much every circumstance we're in. And intention and clarity are linked. There's a link to these two concepts. So some of what I'm going to share this morning is a bit on the basic side. We're going to just start with what is communication before we begin to talk about this whole intention piece. But I hope what I share this morning will get you thinking about what communication is, why we need it so much, and how we can do it most effectively. This is a basic definition here. Obviously, effective communication is this transmission of information from one person to another. And I think it's very important to get firmly grounded in this concept that when we speak, we haven't necessarily communicated. It depends on how that communication has landed with the person we are in communication with. So we've got the sender and we've got the receiver. And as we all know, it's honestly fairly rare that the two of us in the communication are on the same page, actually hear the same thing, actually understand the same thing. So that's why I've put down at the bottom of this slide, effective communication is actually hard work. And that's something I think we don't think about because communication is so ubiquitous. We do it all the time. We do it every day. And now we do it in all these ways that we didn't used to do it, like texting, for example, email, all these ways of communicating that have, I think we could all say that we're over communicated too, right? We receive so much information and so much so many garbled messages. So I think we're also in kind of a state of communication overwhelm, if you will. But that may be one reason why the more we communicate doesn't necessarily mean the better we get at it. That's one point I want to make. So there's this idea that communication is a two-way street. And whenever we're communicating in any circumstance, we are part of a dyad, at least. We always are in communication with someone. And that means that if we're just in our little world over here and we're just thinking, well, this is what I want to say, we're not thinking about what might that other person want or need to hear, how might they hear what we're saying, how might they interpret our words, how might they perceive our countenance and the way that we're coming across. All of those things contribute to that communication event being successful or not. So we have to think about the fact that it takes two to tango. When I teach presentation skills, I always talk a lot about audience. Who are you speaking to? In the case of a presentation, you may have a fairly large audience. So there are lots of different people you're communicating with, and each one of those people can take your message in a different way or interpret the words you use with some type of different meaning. In one-on-one communication, we're just dealing with one other person. So we don't have as tough of a job to figure out how that person might perceive our message, but we still very much have to think about where that person is coming from and where they might be sitting, what they might be sitting with in the moment that we're communicating with them. So this idea that communication is dynamic, it's never static, and it pretty much never goes the way we think it will. If you think about it, it often doesn't. And if there are moments when communication hasn't gone well, we definitely need to figure out why, what went wrong, do a little bit of an analysis after the fact, which is where we often learn the most about, what did go wrong in that communication? I'm sure all of you have had those kinds of circumstances where you've realized, if I can't see everybody, but if anybody wants to unmute to just share for a second, maybe a recent communication you had where you were aware that it hadn't gone well, I'd be interested to hear from someone. Anybody going to be brave and share? Let me see if I can. Well, that's fine. This is kind of a one-way deal here, so I won't belabor that. I just want to get where I can see my slides again. However, I'm sure all of you could think of a moment when you felt either that you were misunderstood or that someone interpreted what you said in a way that you really didn't anticipate. We were like, whoa, I didn't think that conversation was going to go there. I didn't think that person was going to take what I said the way they took it. So the thing about communication is that there are many, many elements to it. The words that we speak are actually a pretty limited part of all of communication taken in as a whole. And I'll share a slide in a minute that gives us a breakdown of that, which I'm sure most of you have seen. However, when we think about all of these different elements, it means that there's a lot to consider as we communicate. Words are one element, but then we have body language. This is called kinesic behavior, posture, gestures, facial expressions, all of those things that happen sort of outside of our consciousness oftentimes, especially facial expressions. We're often not super aware of what shows up on our face, particularly if we have very expressive faces, and that can vary by the person. There's the whole aspect of proxemics, which is where we are in space with other people. And when I think about this particularly, negotiation comes up for me, because there's actually been research about the difference in outcomes and the feeling in a negotiation if you're across the table or if you're next to each other. How people are positioned in a space actually influences what gets communicated and how things land. We can even think about people being angry with each other and really getting into each other's faces. That's extremely close spatially. So all of that impacts that message, impacts how we're coming across and how we're being perceived. Paralanguage is super interesting. This is one of my favorite areas of communication. It's this all of the things that go into tone of voice, inflection, volume. Every little nuance in our voice sends a message. The tone of our voice itself sends messages. We all know that. When I was little, younger, if my mother said, Barbara Ann, I knew I was in trouble, right? We all know those. And of course, with mothers and daughters and family members, a lot is communicated in just tone. We react to tones. And it could be that you're in communication with someone professionally and the tone of their voice mimics something from your childhood, and you react kind of unconsciously. So this paralanguage is super important in the whole realm of communication. And then there's this thing called object language, which is how we look and what we wear. Color is important in this respect, and level of formality. If we're involved in a communication event and we want our message to come across in a certain way, do I need to wear a tie in this circumstance, for example? Or if I'm a woman, do I want to be wearing a dress? What color or are pants fine? All of that physical and appearance related stuff actually also plays a role in how our message comes across and how it lands and what that impression is that we're making. The bottom line is we really can't help but communicate. Even if we think we're not communicating something, we probably are communicating something. How many of us make a little face if we're annoyed, right? It's like the diss. I really got very in touch with this when I lived in Italy. I lived in Italy for 11 years. I became super fluent in Italian while I lived there. And of course, Italian communication style is very, very nonverbal. You can watch an Italian person walking down the street on their phone, gesturing wildly, and figure out kind of what that conversation is about. They don't minimize their gestures at all. So I would get caught out by them because of stuff that would show up on my face, emotions, irritation. It was often irritation because in Italy, they tell you one thing and then something else usually happens. And I would arrive at a training or something and they would have told me there were going to be 15 people and there were 5 or whatever the case might have been. And I would just be kind of like, that little, and I would immediately offend the person in front of me because they would have read what was on my face and they would have that communicated something to them. And I caused them to lose face basically with that little teeny gesture. So this idea that we're always communicating, we can't help but communicate, is something to be aware of, because every little thing we do with our body, with our face, with our tone is communicating something. And in the line of work that you are in, and particularly in the case of a labor negotiation, for example, all of that is going to have a massive effect. It colors the entire situation. So we have to be super mindful, and we're going to see that that's part of intentional communication. This is the famous Albert Mehrabian data that gets thrown out a lot, and it's often incorrectly interpreted. So I did want to make sure that I communicated that. His research was about messages that pertain to feelings and attitudes. And that is where these percentages actually are most accurate. If someone's giving a purely informational presentation, this data might not particularly apply. But if you think about it, a lot of our communication is related to feelings and attitudes. So it covers a lot. This is the point about our words not counting all that much in the way our message is interpreted. And some people believe that it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I've always been on different sides of the fence on this one. I do believe that what you say is important, and we're going to talk about words. However, it's really critical to notice here that 38% of a message, how a message is received, is based on that paralanguage, the tone, the pitch, the volume, all of those things. And a lot of that is related to voice and voice quality. And then the biggest percentage is that facial expression or that gesture that we make that communicates something. And because that carries so much weight in communication, one of the things that I teach and coach about is coherence between what is said and any gesture or facial expression that you might make. I think we've all seen that, where you tell someone something that you maybe consider to be true or factual, and the person kind of goes, "Oh, really?" So the tone of the voice, what their words are saying, "Oh, really," can be said with a lot of different intonations, but that would immediately indicate they didn't really believe you, right? You would hear in that tone and the way that they said it, and maybe the expression on their face that, they're not buying this. So that's an example. Another example I have of, well, it's kind of a long example, so I might do that one in another slide, but just to say that those words that we put out there are not the only thing that's communicating our message. And that's very important to take away. Now, this next slide has a little bit of a funny background on it. I put this here for a reason. These are all factors that impact the effectiveness of communication, and many of them interfere with whether or not our communication is going to be effective and successful. And I don't necessarily want to go into these in detail, because each one of them I could spend a half an hour talking about. However, I wanted to show you the list of things that can get in our way or get in the way of effective communication. And the reason I put the Neanderthals on the back here is that much of this is hardwired. This is not stuff that we can avoid, because we're humans and the way our brain works and our history and trying to determine whether someone was a friend or a foe. All of that is in our amygdala brain, and it's still there. So things like first impressions, we're going to make them. We're always going to have a first impression, and we make a first impression, which impacts the way that somebody perceives us, impacts how they listen to our message. Stereotyping plays into this. The halo effect is that idea of, if you feel that one person, the characteristics of one person from a group are positive, you're going to think that everybody is positive. Every aspect of that group is positive. It's related to stereotyping, but it's kind of the reverse. Perceptual defense is this idea of ignoring a message that might be insensitive or offensive to us. We just tune it out. We don't hear it. The idea of selective perception, men or women think that men are selective, always have this selective perception, but that's the idea of, we take in what's obvious to us and what goes along with our interests and our biases, but we don't let the other stuff in. We don't pay attention to things that we're unfamiliar with. Then assumptions. I actually wrote a LinkedIn post about assumptions the other day. And these are beliefs that we have that fly under the radar. When we are dealing with an assumption, it's oftentimes something that we couldn't answer a question about. The example that I give, when I was studying Italian at Università per Stranieri in Perugia, there was I think she was Romanian. This was the mid-90s, so the wall had not fallen that much before this event took place. And she was Eastern European. She had grown up in the communist part of the world. And one day she said to me, "So what's so great about democracy anyway?" And I was like, well, I'm not sure. And I found myself unable to answer the question, because democracy was something that was so much part of my life. I took it for granted. It wasn't something I'd ever really thought about, that I couldn't answer the question. So that's when you know you're dealing with an assumption, is if somebody calls you out on your assumption and you're a little bit like, well, I don't know. That's how we figure out that we're operating from or being influenced by an assumption that we hold. Attribution is also a bit complicated. I don't want to go into that super deeply, but that's we attribute we try to find reasons for people's behavior. And this could very much play into a negotiation type situation. We might wonder why someone is acting in a certain way, or why they won't agree a point, or why they call a break. In negotiating, there are all kinds of things that happen that are designed to discombobulate the other side a little bit. And we might be trying to figure out what's their intent here. And that attribution is, if what we think they're doing is negative, we'll probably attribute it to them personally, something internal within them, like they're just a bad person, or they're a horrible negotiator, or whatever the case might be. If it's something related to us, we might say, well, it's just a circumstance. We attribute it to external circumstances. All of these things, I'm just putting this up here to help you understand that there are a lot of things that we can't turn off or particularly avoid that impact communication and how effective it is. And in many cases, it negatively affects the outcome or the circumstance. So we just want to be aware of these things. Communication breakdown, we all know that that happens. Negotiations break down, but just communication in general can break down for several different reasons. The bottom line reason is often it has to do with the decoding of the message. The sender intends one meaning, but the receiver applies a different meaning to the words, to the tone. So, and that's usually what has gone wrong. And that lack of coherence is sometimes a problem that I mentioned before. And then oftentimes communication breaks down simply because too much is given at one time. The listener is overwhelmed. The receiver can't sort it all out. Not enough structure is involved in communicating the message so that people can easily break it down and follow. So all of those things can interfere and cause a breakdown. Indirect communication, it occurred to me that this can actually be relevant for the situation of a negotiation. Messages conveyed by a third party. That's a little bit like the telephone game where somebody whispers in and then somebody whispers and then somebody whispers. And by the end of the chain, the message is quite different than what was originally communicated. So that's something that can sometimes cause a breakdown in communication. It's also true that that third party is going to apply an intonation perhaps, or it would be very difficult for that third party to communicate a message totally neutrally. So something could get miscommunicated simply because of something that messenger was unaware of that was happening with their communication. A lack of familiarity between the communicators is another way that communication can break down. If you don't know someone well, you're not going to be good at interpreting their nonverbals or their tone. So in the case of a labor negotiation, it would seem to me that it would be somewhat important for those negotiators to have had some level of relationship building or some level of familiarity simply in how they communicate the messages. Obviously, differences in experience, perception, and knowledge of the communicators, that's where the messages are going to get confounded. If the sender is using words or talking about something that the receiver isn't familiar with or doesn't have experience with, or their experience is completely different from that of the sender about that same thing, then we have the possibility for communication breakdown. Status differences can sometimes influence how messages are perceived. The sender who's at a higher level of status might think, I'm making a suggestion, whereas the subordinate person might think that was an order. I have to do this. So that can play havoc in communication. And then I threw this one in, the physical barriers to communication. Right now, we're communicating in a virtual context where we can't get a strong sense of each other. A lot of the proxemics is actually removed. We don't have space. We're not in a space together. And then all of the other things that go into us knowing who another person is, which has to do with our senses. It's the eyes, it's the nose, smell. All of those things are removed from this environment. So I haven't read any research about this, but I would say that high-level negotiations done virtually, I have read a little bit about that in the context of international negotiation, because those negotiations can often happen virtually, and they are more difficult. You have to be more careful with what you say, and the tone of the voice takes a larger role in people's impression of each other, because we don't have a lot of those other indicators in the space. I want to talk just for a minute about this idea of listening. We were talking a lot about speaking and what is said. However, a huge part of communication, maybe more than 50%, we could say, is the listening part. That communication has to be received, and it's received through the ear and the eyes. I thought this quote was super interesting when I came across it, this idea that we don't listen to understand, we listen to respond. We're often thinking of the next thing we want to say before we fully digested what the other person has said. Have you ever had that experience where you've been speaking? This used to happen to me all the time in Italy, because Italy, they're interrupters. They interrupt people in conversation. And it tended to happen when I was speaking to an Italian man, a male. I would start saying what I was going to say, and he would cut me off, interrupt me, and answer the question he thought I was going to ask. And a lot of times it was not the question I was going to ask. It wasn't. I really felt not heard. I would have to then start again to ask the question I really wanted to ask, and try to get the answer. But I think even in non-intercultural communication, we're often not tuned in. And how much that's been impacted by our devices is scary. We're looking at a screen, we're texting, we're half paying attention to what's being said. And I think this is huge for all of us in any type of communication. But when you're in that negotiation, you have to very much listen with that idea that I really want to understand what this person is saying or trying to communicate to me, rather than immediately thinking about what is my response going to be. Sometimes you see negotiators at a table and they've got papers in front of them, and they're possibly even following a sort of script that's been written. That leaves very little or space for spontaneity and for really responding to that person in the moment. So as we're going to see, that's a huge component of intentional communication, is responding authentically in the moment. Why do we communicate may seem like a super obvious question, but there were a couple of things that I wanted to get to by asking it. We obviously exchange our values, perceptions, we exchange information. It's the way that we interact with people. So it's fundamental in relationships. We sometimes are communicating to influence the behavior of other people. And that's what we usually refer to as persuasive communication. We often are trying to create understanding. Sometimes we confuse things, we confound things, and things get murkier before they get more clear. However, creating understanding is all about getting that clear message across, and also checking to make sure that understanding has been created. Have we accomplished our goal? And we'll see that there's a little bit more on that later in the presentation. We communicate, obviously, to build and maintain relationships. And I really wanted to get this point in. And in fact, it was what I added this morning. But the whole idea of the role that communication plays in creating and maintaining trust. If you think about it, we trust people often because they do what they say they will do. We term that integrity. That's basically being integral. I say what I'm going to do, and then I do it. If you think about the link there with communication, that saying what we're going to do clearly and in a way that everybody understands is fundamental to this creation of trust. I'm sure you've been in situations where somebody hasn't been integral. They've done something that you didn't think they said they were going to do, but then you call them out on it and they're like, well, I said I was going to do that. That's exactly what I said I was going to do. So you can see the risk here for trust either being broken or not being able to be established in the first place. And this goes into an area that's too broad for us to cover this morning, but it's this whole idea of a culture in an organization that fosters the development of trust, creating a space in which people truly feel listened to, they feel heard as opposed to just spoken to. And that requires a certain walking the talk from the top. It requires an environment that fosters this type of communication. So in labor relations and the type of work that you all are involved in, I think this is a really, really key factor. Does in that organization in which these two parties coexist, is there this foundation of trust? And is it created through the communication that occurs in the organization? Low communication in an organization obviously would not be positive. It wouldn't have a positive effect. People talking at the top and then not following up or not doing what they say would obviously have a negative effect. So this is something that might seem outside of someone's control. However, it's a very, very important fact to be taken into account when we want that positive outcome in a negotiation. I put a scenario on this slide, and I'll ask you to put your responses in the chat. I'll let you read this. So you're at work in the middle of doing something. The phone rings. You answer it, and it's Larry. You're not super crazy about Larry. I hope there's nobody named Larry on this call. However, Larry has some important information that you need in order to finish a report. He's calling to tell you that he still doesn't have the information that you need, but he's working on it. What would be running through your mind? Just throw it into the chat. He's not going to do it. I hate working with Larry. I'm going to tell Larry how important the information is. Oh, it's old Larry again. Right. You want to know how soon he might have it. You're thinking he's not organized. Put Larry in a headlock. I like that, Randall. Thank you. Last minute, it's not going to be his best work. Yeah. So most of this is not terribly positive. We're not thinking about, you're not thinking great things about Larry at this point. So the next question on the slide here is, how do you communicate back in that situation? And how do you think, what do you think Larry would perceive? Do you think he's going to perceive that you're a little bit pissed off? You can just put yes or no. Yep, tone's important, absolutely. That ugh, G, right. Whatever you say next to Larry, is he going to perceive the ugh? Yeah. Yeah, he definitely will. And this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. I taught a course for a little while that was supervisory skills, leadership for supervisors. And one of the questions, one of the modules we had in that training was, do people know what you're thinking? And it was really about, for those, I hope you guys can you see that chat box? Sorry, I didn't know I put it over there. The thing is that people do know what we're thinking because it comes through in our voice, in our body language, and it's mostly that feedback is nonverbal. Now, if you're on the phone with Larry, he's going to hear it. He's not necessarily going to see, like this guy, he's got his hand up and he's looking concerned, and he's like, in Italian, we would say, ma che cosa? That's speaking with my hands in Italian there. But that this is what we call unintentional communication. We all have these internal scripts running in our minds all the time. And I think many of us are very unaware the degree to which that stuff gets communicated, that negative stuff. Even if we try to put on the nice, suave, smooth voice, it's going to come across as inauthentic oftentimes. This results in this sloppy kind of unintended communication. The fact that we aren't paying attention, we could damage the relationship with Larry depending on how we communicate with him. If we're like, oh, we might even sigh. There might be that little, really, Larry? We're thinking, really, Larry? But it comes out in our voice. The irritation will show up. So this kind of unintentional communication can be very damaging in many different kinds of situations. And then there's also the perception that we make. And I'm actually going to give you a kind of embarrassing example of this. It just happened to me the other day. I just thought of this. I was talking to a gentleman who had booked a call with me to do a little free assessment of his pitch. And we chatted, and he kind of gave me his pitch. It was pretty confusing. And I realized as the conversation went on that he really didn't want help. He was a person who thought he already knew, and he wasn't open to whatever kind of feedback I was maybe going to give him. And I'm aware now, thinking back on it, that showed up in my voice because he disconnected at a certain point. And I didn't realize it in the moment, but I'm pretty sure that what I was thinking was, oh, well, this guy, he's not open. He's not going to take my feedback. He's probably not going to become a client. At some point that I communicated something related to that with my voice, and possibly something I did on the screen too. I'm not 100% sure about that. So this can happen to all of us, even those of us who would consider ourselves to be professionals and know better, because it's that script running that takes over. It's an autopilot thing. So becoming aware of our script is part of what intentional communication is all about. So that's what we're getting to right now. This idea of speaking and listening with conscious awareness of our purpose. So what do we want out of this communication? What do we need out of this communication? And keeping in mind the effect of our words and our tone on others, on that receiver of the message. This idea of consciousness, being mindful, is really the basis of intentional communication. Being mindful of what we say, being mindful of how we say it, is what intentional communication is. I found an interesting distinction in what I was reading and preparing for this. And so there was one person who broke out intention versus purpose. A lot of the definitions of intentional communication that you read will simply involve communicating with purpose or with your purpose in mind. However, this person made the distinction and said that intention is that emotional impact that your communication has. It's the how you would like to be heard and how you would like your audience to feel. And this has to do both with probably the words, but also very much the how, the tone of voice, the warmth that you're able or not able to have in your voice, the feeling that you can evoke in that audience. Whereas purpose is more about the actual message itself and how you want that message to land. So the purpose part for me is more about the words, whereas the intention part is more about the other two categories of input there, the paralanguage, intonation, voice, and then also expression and body language and those nonverbals. If we put the two together, we get very powerful communication. And this is something that Martin Luther King was just a master of, probably very naturally. And there I nominate probably a lot of other powerful speakers who have that ability to influence and to make people really feel something and engage. And I'm not saying that all of us have to get to that point. However, that would be the gold standard, maybe we could say, when it comes to this idea of intentional communication. So we now come to the how. And I think I'm probably a little over time here. How do we arrive at this ability to speak intentionally? or communicate intentionally. And I will say that it was on an earlier slide. This is not easy stuff. This takes effort and it takes commitment. It takes a desire to communicate more effectively and to be super intentional in our communication, the way that we communicate. So this first idea is this idea of being present with the script in your mind, being present with what the other person just said, staying very much in the moment with the communication event, and thinking before we speak, not just throwing random words or random emotion into a circumstance, but controlling that to a degree. And if we think about this in the context of a negotiation, for example, if you react and you just throw something out based on what's been said, based on the other person or the other team, you could really throw a wrench into the works. You could derail a negotiation. You could undo work that's already been done. So this can be super important. Being impeccable with your word is a quote from Don Miguel Ruiz. Many of you have probably read the Four Agreements, but this idea that our words matter, the words that we choose to use make a huge difference. So we want to be choosing our words. We don't want to just be using random words. It's important to remain conscious of what you are feeling in the moment and deciding whether or not that's appropriate to that particular situation. As I mentioned, sometimes a tone can evoke our mother's voice immediately and we just react. What's the level of emotion we're feeling? Is it appropriate? And how much of it should we express? Monitoring and adjusting our tone and our body language. So, there's a certain level of control here. And I threw this last one in because in certain circumstances, silence may actually be the best response, at least briefly. Give it a pause. Let that message land, but don't feel that you have to respond immediately, that you can take a time, you can breathe, you can consider your response. This is the last, we're getting right down to the end here, but this idea of practicing reflexive listening. This is the repeat back technique. And not everybody likes it. So I mentioned here that you might want to ask permission, but it is insanely good for clarity. Either telling the other person what you just heard them say, and then asking the other person to tell you what they heard. The thing about this is that intonation is super important. If you have any condescension or any "you're stupid" running through your mind when you ask the other person to tell you what they heard you say, it'll fail. And I think we all know, I hope you know what I'm talking about. That. So what do you think I just said? Right? It's that dissing kind of intonation pattern. It needs to be said very neutrally and very authentically and curiously. I really want to know. But this is a super technique if people are open to it. And then I just will end here with a few best practices that occurred to me in your context, in the context of labor relations. This idea of choosing our words means using vocabulary that's accessible to everyone, words that everybody will know and attribute a similar meaning to. Keeping our messages concise, linear, and logical, and that's very much a US American way of communicating. Acknowledging the values, beliefs, and assumptions of all parties. So the idea that if somebody's values are different than ours, we're aware of it, and possibly making that explicit in the frame of the conversation. I think something in negotiation that maybe doesn't happen all the time, but is good practice, is this idea of answering the question that was asked. Even if you want to say something else about it, giving that answer first is going to satisfy our interlocutor, the other person in the interaction, and will allow us then to say whatever else we want to say once we've answered the question. But if you answer a question with something that's off base, it's going to skew the conversation or the clarity involved. Sticking to relevant objective facts is pretty good negotiation practice. And then being very consistent in your words and in your actions. Inconsistency in communication undermines trust and undermines effective communication. So definitely consistency. And I would say if it's a team negotiation, you want some type of consistency in the communication from the team. Although I know sometimes there's a good cop and a bad cop, and those kinds of strategies can play into a negotiation as well. So that's all I have. I'd ask for any questions. If you can put them in the chat, or you can just take yourself off mute and ask.
I'll ask a question, Barbara.
Great, Randall.
No, Bob.
Oh, sorry. I thought Randall was speaking. Sorry, Bob.
So for the last year, I haven't seen one client in person, haven't seen one union rep or supervisor or employee in person. All of my negotiations have been over video conferencing. And when we do the video conferencing, not everybody is viewed in the screen. You know, sometimes the cameras doesn't encompass the whole group. And then even with the clients I'm working with, they're not even in the same room I'm in. And that has been a real challenge in doing what we did in a very traditional way for many, many years. Any advice on that?
I really feel your pain. I think that's a very, very difficult circumstance to be in. And I do think that negotiation is one of those activities that probably isn't well served by a virtual environment, because so much of negotiation is the energy in the room and the feeling between the parties and the handshake at the beginning and the backslap and whatever else might go on in those contexts. So I think that having everything happen virtually it's almost sterile. There's a sterility to it. I would say that if anything could help the circumstance, it would be extra rapport building, or moments of conversation or communication not related to the task that might help some, because that's the thing that we're missing there, is that relational component. And if you go out of your way to set up a chat or a coffee or something with the people involved in the situation beforehand, just even 10 minutes or a few minutes, just to check in and how are you, and if it's somebody you haven't seen in a while, to build that little bit of camaraderie and warmth, might then impact a little bit the task-oriented conversation or event that's going to go on. So that's one thing that I can contribute.
Thanks. Randall's hand is up.
All right, Randall, now you're going to ask a question.
Okay. Yeah. So my notes that I took was, you noted in reference to lack of familiarity. Yeah. So I know and you also noted about barriers. So in reference to barriers, of course, we're, doing a lot through Zoom or Teams. So when you have a lack of familiarity,
That's a tough one.
hard time with that word today. But when you have these barriers, like, what are things that you can do where you can't normally do in person? Normally when you're in person, you can do little tricks that you have with your personality to kind of make someone feel a little more comfortable with you, to open up, and you can't do those things over Zoom. So what are different tricks that you recommend that can open
Make
up
for that
communication barrier, since you have those barriers now, since you're doing everything virtual now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there is some there. I don't think there are any tricks. Tricks would be a little bit too, not the right term to use, but kind of the same response I gave to Bob, is this idea of paying extra attention and putting more energy into building the relationship that you can build over Zoom. I would definitely say that if you are meeting, like you have an interaction for a negotiation or serious business conversation with someone that you've never met, that you really haven't interacted with before, some type of informal communication before that would be super helpful. You can call it a get to know. You can call it, just a coffee chat or whatever, but it's that idea that you're going to interact in this environment on Zoom. You're going to get a sense of how each of you does that. You're going to get a little bit of familiarity, just the sound of the voice, maybe it's eye contact or it's some other quirk that the person has. Quirk, I don't want to say that in such a negative way, but like sometimes people will swivel around in their chair or they'll have little mannerisms. You want to try to get to know that as much as you can, get to know that other person before you enter that formal communication event. It's not ideal and it's not perfect, but to just charge into a hardcore business interaction or task-oriented interaction without having any familiarity with that person, I think is super dangerous because things can definitely be taken the wrong way. The other thing I would say is that we all struggle with this whole concept of eye contact on Zoom. Right now, I'm looking right at that little green dot. And I hope that you feel that I'm looking right at you. Is that the way it's coming through?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you noticed before that I was looking over here because that's where you are. I was looking at you. So this is something we all struggle with.
Yeah.
How it's very hard for me to talk to you looking at this little green dot.
Right.
So that's another thing in the interaction you have with people via Zoom is that when you need to make a very strong point or difficult point, look at the camera because they are going to perceive that you're then looking at them and they're going to be able to perceive that communication as heartfelt or sincere or whatever the case might be. But if you're looking somewhere else on this, it's really horrible when the person's all the way down here, then we have to pull our eyes up. So I hope those are a couple of things that help you.
Right.
Randall.
Right. And I also did have just one quick comment because in one of your slides, you actually touched on Covey. And I actually took a class of his. This was like years ago, maybe like 10 plus years ago. And I've actually read a few of his books, but I love this thing right here. It's called a talking stick.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
That's a great concept.
And I actually take it with me when I go out in the field because, when I'm engaging with people, they're maybe like normally when I go out, they're not happy. So,
right.
So this item, it says, seek to first understand. And then on the side, it says seek. Then it says, then to be understood. And that is pretty much what you noted in reference to listening,
absolutely,
with intent and not just in trying to understand the person. So thank you for
well, and the other those sticks are very cool. I think I have one here. I don't exactly know where it is, but it's an American Indian, a Native American one. But the other really cool thing about that, Randall, is that you make sure that you give people voice,
right?
That everyone's voice is heard. Right. And it establishes that expectation that everyone will have that possibility to speak. So that's a super tool. Excellent. Right.
Yeah.
So
thanks for sharing that.
We have come to the end of our session.
We have.
Yes, we have. It actually went 3 minutes over. So I want to thank Barbara and I thank everybody for signing up. Please attend the remainder of ours right through June. And I hope to one day see everybody in person. Take care now.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.